A young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is visiting Japan from May 26th through 29th at the invitation of Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. According to Japanese media, Marcos and Takaichi are expected to get down to business in talks focused on defense and energy issues amid China's so-called growing military assertiveness and turmoil in the Middle East. And this visit comes just a few days after Takaichi's wrapped up her visit to the Republic of Korea, where ROK President Lee Jae-myung hosted her in his hometown, marking their fourth meeting in about 6 months to push for greater cooperation between these two historical Asian rivals. Now, in terms of the coming visit of the Philippine president, the trip is happening amid rising Indo-Pacific tensions. Meanwhile, domestically, Japan's ruling coalition is further pushing to revise key security documents, raise defense spending, and expand military capabilities. Under Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, Japan has adopted a more assertive posture, sparking debate over regional stability and East Asia security dilemma. How do we understand these moves and what impact could it bring? To delve deeper into these questions and more, today we're joined in Tokyo by Jeff Kingston, Professor of Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. Also in Tokyo, we have Tai Wei Lim, Professor of Soka University. And in Shanghai, we have Yan Chen, tenured Associate Professor at the School of Humanities at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Now, Professor Yang, let me start with you. Japan and the Philippines are expected to elevate their relations to so-called comprehensive strategic partnership, while security cooperation are expected to be a key focus on their agenda. What does all this reveal about the changing security landscape between these two countries, but also in the broader Indo-Pacific region?
Some media reports point out that Japan and the Philippines plan to upgrade their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership is designed to deepen cooperation across security and economic domains, with an eye on China's maritime stance in the East and the South China Seas. This elevation also reflects historical recalibration of Japan's strategic posture in the region. For most of the post-war era, Japan operated on the constraints of its peace constitution, deliberately keeping a low security profile across Southeast Asia. That strength was not merely a legal obligation, it was politically necessary because memory of Japan's imperial expansion during the Second World War remained vivid across the region, including in the Philippines. What we're witnessing today is a deliberate effort by Tokyo to recast itself from a checkbook security partner into an active, operationally engaged one. The comprehensive strategic partnership signals that Japan is now prepared to offer not just economic assistance, but intelligence, defense equipment, capacity building, and strategic coordination. So in my view, deepening Japan-Philippines security cooperation does not contribute to the stabilization of the Indo-Pacific, but may instead produce a more fragmented and tension-prone order in the region.
Professor Kingston, ahead of the visit, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos said he hopes Japan can clarify Manila's position in Japan's evolving defense posture. What do you think President Ferdinand Marcos hoped to hear from the Japanese Prime Minister? And what can Prime Minister Takaichi realistically offer the Philippines?
Clearly, what Takaichi offers is upgrading the military capacity of the Philippines to defend its claims in what it calls the West Philippine Sea. And beyond Japan...
Which we call the South China Sea, of course. But go ahead, sir.
Yes. I'm just saying that's what the Philippines refers to it as. And so they are planning to transfer some used destroyers, which are more or less like frigates, and those will help the Philippines monitor and defend its coastal waters. Beyond that, there is a intelligence sharing pact that is probably going to be signed. And so I think that Takaichi is responding to the risk posed by an increasingly unreliable and erratic U.S. ally. For quite some time, Japan has totally relied on the United States for its security interest. And now there are a lot of good questions being raised about whether the sort of transactional president can be relied on. And so Japan's trying to do more for itself, building up its own military capacity, but also helping regional partners build up theirs. So this is all part of that free and open Indo-Pacific vision that Abe articulated back in 2016.
Professor Kingston, what do you think is the role of the United States in all this? Of course, Japan has traditionally and conventionally been at the forefront, doing the jobs for Washington, or doing the jobs that Washington do not necessarily want to appear to be doing itself. Now, given the new positioning of China-U.S. relations to a constructive relationship of strategic stability between President Xi and President Trump, what do you expect to be Japan's role going forward, and Washington's dictation for that matter?
Well, I think that she's trying to strengthen trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Korea, and Japan, and also the U.S., the Philippines, and Japan. So both countries are U.S. allies, and so I think that Takaichi wants to strengthen these regional security partnerships. Whether she can do that, that's a big question. But I don't think many people in Tokyo are convinced that the U.S.-China relationship is yet on a stable path. Early days, they are good signs, but I think there's an abiding concern in the Takaichi administration that President Xi and Trump will cut some deal, shake hands over Tokyo's head, and perhaps Japanese interest might not be fully attended to.
All right. Now, another key question is Taiwan. Professor Lim, let me ask you about this. In an interview with Japanese media in Manila before his visit, President Marcos touched upon the Taiwan question by saying this. He said, in the Philippines, we do not have a choice between Taiwan because Taiwan is so close to the Philippines, and we have almost 200,000 Filipino nationals living and working in Taiwan. What do you expect to be the Philippines' position in the Taiwan question?
Well, the position was articulated by President Marcos in his interview with the global media, as well as Japanese media before his trip to Japan. Right now, as the chair of ASEAN, his first priority is to focus on the code of conduct with China to ensure that the South China Sea issue can be resolved. At this point of time, I think the progress of ASEAN and China Code of Conduct talks have become the stage where they have all combined different documents with regard to the discussion under one single document. So as the ASEAN chair, the Philippines hope that this can progress forward before he passes on the ASEAN chair to the next rotational ASEAN chair. Therefore, he's stressing on peace and stability in that area of the maritime territories.
You worked and lived from the ASEAN for the longest time. So tell us a bit about ASEAN perception against China versus that vis-a-vis Japan in the past few years. Japan, of course, coming in as a strong economic and investment partner for many countries over the decades. But China has recently been a key player in ASEAN's economic, social, and cultural life.
ASEAN is a very important intermediary between China and Japan because one of the principal mechanism in which the Northeast Asian countries can communicate with each other, CJK, China, Japan, Korea, is through ASEAN Plus 3. So ASEAN's priority is to facilitate dialogue, understanding, and avoidance of any accidental conflicts through its ASEAN Plus 3 mechanism, which is essentially one of the principal platforms in which Northeast Asia can communicate with each other and also with Southeast Asia. Economically, ASEAN is also very keen to engage both China and Japan through the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the largest free trade agreement in the world. So through these two platforms, ASEAN plays a very important intermediary role between the two countries because it regards both Northeast Asian countries, China and Japan, as very important to uphold peace and stability in the region, even as it engages all big powers, superpowers, and middle powers.
There have been dramatic shifts in the security dynamics here in East Asia. Now, Japan argues that its recent defense reforms are a response to an increasingly complex security environment. Yet for many of its neighbors, memories of history make any shift in Japan's military posture highly sensitive. Do you think East Asia is ready for this new era, is entering a new phase of strategic mistrust?
I do think this constitutes a shift in the kind of trust issue in East Asia. But as a historian, I also want to push back against the framing that treats it as a sudden or surprising. The trajectory of Japanese military expansion has been visible for at least 3 decades. Since the early 1990s, Japan has been progressively reinterpreting, stretching, and ultimately revising the legal and constitutional constraints on its military posture. And what of these recent moves collectively did was to formalize and accelerate a progress that has already long underway. So the argument made in Tokyo and echoed by Japan's allies is that all of this is a necessary, proportionate response to a deteriorating security environment. However, for countries in East Asia, China, South Korea, and others, Japan's military expansion simply cannot be measured in a historical vacuum. The post-war security order in this region was premised in part on a Japan that had genuinely reckoned with its past and accepted meaningful constraints on its military power. When those constraints were dismantled nowadays, it raises an unavoidable question. Has Japan's historical accountability matched the growth of its military ambitions? In my opinion, Japan's military expansion, absent a deeper and more credible process of historical settlement with its neighbors, may generate mistrust between Japan and its neighboring countries, and that is ultimately detrimental for East Asia's security landscape as a whole.
Do you think Japan, beyond the policy changes and military debates, Japan is undergoing a more fundamental and deeper shift in its post-war identity? The strategic narrative, top-down, is changing, regardless of ordinary folks not caring about politics, but for the strategic elites who are deciding policies. For decades, pacifism was not only a constitutional principle, but also part of Japan's national self-image. But do you see that changing now?
Well, Japan's lost decades did produce a profound sense of national anxiety, a feeling that country's post-war model of identity formed since the early 1960s, built around economic dynamism and civilian soft power has resourced itself. And when the economic miracle phase and when demographic decline makes the future feel generally uncertain, societies will often seek alternative sources of national purpose and pride. In Japan's case, we have seen a rehabilitation of military symbolism, a softening of public resistance to defense spending, and a political discourse that increasingly frames national strength in security terms rather than economic or cultural ones. So historians sometimes call this the externalization of domestic anxiety, the tendency of societies under internal stress to project itself their insecurities outward onto foreign threats and the geopolitical challenges. Japan's economy has been recovering. For example, growth is projected at around 1.3% in 2025, driven by sustained wage gains, strong business investment, and robust export performance. So what this suggests is that Japan's security assertiveness is not simply a product of anxiety and insecurity. It may actually reflect the opposite, a society that has regained enough confidence to pursue what Japanese politicians had long called the normal nation aspiration, the desire to share the exceptional constitutional constraints of the post-war era and participate in international security fights on equal terms with other major powers.
The change is subtle yet significant. Professor Kingston, Japan has been strengthening defense ties not only with the Philippines, but also with countries such as Australia and the United States under the framework of the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific. How do you see and how do you understand Japan's broader strategic calculations and ambitions?
Well, yes, Japan engages in joint military drills with Australia, the United States, and India under the Quad. But it hasn't really gone much beyond that, and I think Professor Lim could confirm, but I don't think in ASEAN there's any support for transforming the free and open Indo-Pacific or Quad into like a NATO-like structure. What's curious is that the souring of relations with China has actually boosted Takaichi's public support here. And so she's riding the polls at about 60%, which is quite high by Japanese standards. So she has a bit of a free hand, but the polls indicate that her pet projects are not that popular. A majority of Japanese people oppose her efforts to export lethal weapons. Also, a majority don't want to pay higher taxes to pay for increased defense spending. And not many people are that supportive of her desire to revise Article 9 of the Constitution. There's about an even split. So even though she is popular and she does have a hawkish image, I think that she is constrained by public opinion in significant ways.
And then how do you think China-Japan relations can be fixed, in your opinion?
I think that maybe they just need to sort of dial down the rhetoric and try to figure out areas where they can cooperate. And I think there's plenty of areas where the two countries can cooperate, particularly on economic issues and environmental issues and non-traditional threats to security. So there is room for cooperation. I think right now, however, the attitudes, the leadership in both countries are quite negative. And so I think it's going to take time maybe to heal those wounds.
Right. Now, Professor Lim, East Asia has long been, the engine of economic growth and prosperity. Professor Kingston touched upon that point. I think it's a fair point to make. But today, strategic mistrust and military tensions appear to be rising across the region. Do you think Asia is approaching a geopolitical turning point? I mean, how can East Asia become a hub of economic growth, a growth of innovation like it once was?
East Asia was indeed the engine of the world since the World Bank coined the East Asian region as East Asian economic miracle in the 1990s. Of course, right now, especially from the international circles, they are focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. So East Asia is well positioned within the Indo-Pacific region to prosper from the trade as well as the business ties that are ongoing. They have already signed the RCEP during the pandemic era, the world's largest free trade agreement. CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, is also expanding with the increased participation of the United Kingdom. And also China is interested to join the CPTPP. The original plan was that the CPTPP and the RCEP would then combine together, overlap each other to form the FTAAP, the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, which will be a transnational free trade agreement that will encompass both RCEP, which is very extensive in its coverage in terms of countries participating, because it's essentially a CJK plus ASEAN plus Oceania, as well as CPTPP, which many have nicknamed the golden benchmark of FTA due to its high KPIs and standards benchmarks for the membership. So combining these two free trade agreements together, FTAAP will become possibly the future roadmap of the free trade agreements as well as free trade within the Indo-Pacific and East Asian region. But of course, It must overcome the challenges and difficulties of the current challenges like climate change, polycrisis world where kinetic conflicts are taking place. Something like 60 kinetic conflicts are taking place right now as we speak. And most recently, energy crisis. So these are all common challenges in which the East Asian countries, as well as Indo-Pacific countries, can work together. These are common challenges, no detriments policy, and this can allow them to come together.
I mean, there are economic headwinds, not only externally, but internally as well. Professor Yang, Japan has experienced decades of economic stagnation, demographic decline, and growing social pressure. To what extent do you see these domestic anxieties reflected in the country's foreign policy making?
They lost decades, right? They produce a profound sense of national anxiety. When the economic miracle fails and when demographic decline makes the future feel generally uncertain, societies like Japan often seek alternative sources of national purpose and pride. What Japan did was a kind of like a rehabilitation of military symbolism and softening of public resistance to defense spending and a political discourse that increasingly frames national strength in security terms rather than economic and cultural ones. So nowadays we can say a more assertive Japan than before.
Professor Kingston, neighboring countries remain sensitive to Japan's historical past and security posturing. In your view, how important is historical trust in shaping today's regional perceptions of Japan's growing military role?
Well, I think it's very important. I just want to backtrack a little bit. You know, domestically, there's a lot of opposition to Takaichi's security agenda. You know, back in 2015, there were massive demonstrations against Abe's collective self-defense legislation. And this past few months, we've seen a resurrection of the protests. And protests in Japan are not that common. So when you have tens of thousands of people wanting to protect Article 9 and condemning Takaichi's security legislation, I think that perhaps sends a powerful positive message overseas that people realize, the Japanese people are engaged and they're not apathetic. But clearly, Japan has not really embraced a forthright reckoning of the rampage it inflicted on Asia back in the 1930s and 40s. And so there are government spokesmen from the Abe Takaichi camp who argued that, yes, Japan has apologized quite enough. But I don't think that the perpetrator gets to decide when to stop apologizing. And there's a lot of doubts about just how contrite Japan is over this shared history. That's what makes it really strange that Takaichi and President Lee of Korea have seemed to get along like a house on fire. I mean, given that they come from polar opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, and Lee in the past certainly has held Japan's feet to the fire over that shared past. So I think the problem in Japan is that under Abe, they revised the school textbooks, they whitewashed the history, so that young Japanese are not learning much about the shared history with Asia. They get a sort of polished, gleaming version, one aimed at nurturing patriotic sentiments among the young Japanese people. And so for them, they look at, outsiders, complaining about the past, and they're like confused, like, well, what is it they're all upset about? And I think that this has been one of the consequences of the gutting of Japanese textbooks. For example, when Abe took power, all the secondary school textbooks mentioned the comfort woman, and now none of the mainstream textbooks do. So I think that this is symbolic of a big problem going forward, is that a lot of young people here don't know much about that shared past.
Now, Professor Kingston, why do you think ROK President Lee Jae-myung, from the other side of the political spectrum in Korea, seems to be getting along pretty well with the right-wing leader of Japan, Prime Minister Takaichi?
Well, as they say, politics make strange bedfellows. So I think both sides see an advantage. Perhaps on one side, it's increased concern about the reliability of the United States as an ally. Also, I think there's pressure from Washington on both sides to turn the page on the past and to get along better. But these two frenemies in the past have often been able to find things to squabble about and argue about. So I'm not sure it's going to necessarily be smooth sailing ahead.
All right, with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Hub. Our programs continue on CGTN. Stay tuned and see you next time.
Shh, listen up. Can you hear the heartbeat of our world? It's vibrant and pulsating with the essence of life itself. From the stem of trees to the gurgle of rivers, from the silent strength of mountains to the icy whispers of glaciers, even the solid ground beneath our feet. And right there, in the midst of all, beats the heart of humanity. What if those other heartbeats were to stop? Would ours keep on ticking?